Childhood marked by absence. This story begins in rural France at the end of the 19th century, in a country that prides itself on elegance in its great cities, but that is harsh, slow, and hard in its small towns, where poverty has no glamour or mystery, only cold, mud, and endless days of work. In that context, in the year 1883, Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel is born, the daughter of traveling merchants, into a family that has nothing legendary about it. With no lineage, no illustrious surnames, no fortune, only the rawness of daily survival as its emotional landscape. Before continuing, I am very curious to know from what place in the world and at what time you are joining tonight. I would love to read you in the comments, because in the end, these stories are enjoyed even more when one feels they are sharing them with someone on the other side. That said, we return to Gabrielle, who is not yet Coco, not an icon, not a brand. She is just a child in the arms of a tired mother and a father who is always passing through. With his eyes on the road ahead and his gaze fixed on the next market, the next sale, the next day, when perhaps things will be a little better than yesterday. Her childhood unfolds among journeys, precarious lodgings, and a constant sense of instability. With a father who makes a living as a peddler and a mother who battles illness and exhaustion while trying to keep her children clean, clothed, and with something warm in their stomachs. There are no rooms full of toys or bedtime stories. What there is instead is cold in the winters, suffocating heat in the summers, continuous changes of place, and that early experience of understanding that in life nothing is certain, that the walls that protect you today may disappear tomorrow. That lack of roots slowly seeps into Gabrielle's mind, and she grows up with the feeling that if she wants a place in the world, she will have to build it with her own hands. The tragedy that marks the true breaking point arrives when her mother dies young, defeated by illness and fatigue, leaving the children in an even more fragile situation, as if the only warm light within that daily precariousness had gone out. The father, unable to take responsibility, makes a decision that will become a permanent scar in Gabrielle's emotional biography. He leaves her, along with her sisters, in an orphanage in Aubazine, a place run by nuns, while her brothers are sent to work in the countryside. It is an abandonment disguised as a solution, a way of placing them that, for a child, is lived as a definitive rupture with the very idea of home. The orphanage in Aubazine is not an idyllic place. It is an austere, silent space where discipline is the rule and tenderness is a scarce luxury. However, in the midst of that institutional coldness, there are details that become etched in Gabrielle's memory with surprising force, almost as if they were sketches of her future aesthetic universe. The white walls, the sober corridors, the black of the nuns' habits, the way light enters the cloisters and cuts the shadows with an almost geometric precision. All of that, which for other children might go unnoticed, becomes for her a kind of silent visual school. The nuns teach her sewing, a skill that at that moment is seen as neither heroic nor special, but simply useful, a way to be productive, to have a trade. Sitting for hours and hours behind a needle and thread, she learns to observe fabric, to understand how it falls on the body, how a small modification can completely change the feeling of the person wearing it, how the stiffness or softness of a textile can make a garment feel like armor or like a natural extension of the skin. Without knowing it, on those wooden benches, she is laying the technical foundation that she will later combine with her instinct and her ambition to create something completely different from what the fashion world had known. But before that happens, there is an experience that marks her even more deeply than the sewing lessons. The experience of feeling abandoned. Gabrielle waits for years for her father's return, clings to the idea that one day he will appear at the orphanage door, embrace her, and take her away to a better life. A life in which she does not have to resign herself to the silent humiliation of being the girl left there. That day never comes, and the waiting turns into an explosive mixture of wounded pride and determination, an intimate conviction that she will never allow herself to be seen as a victim, that she will never accept the role of the poor orphan girl destined to live on whatever others decide to give her. From that wound, the character that will, over time, become the essence of Chanel begins to take shape. A personality that appears cold, cutting, with little patience for the sentimental. But beneath that armor, there is a child who learned too early that the world can turn its back on you without blinking, and that the only antidote to that fragility is to make oneself indispensable, to build an identity so strong that no one can ignore it, to dress not only in clothes, but in an attitude that says, "I decide who I am." That mixture of denied vulnerability and fierce pride will become her engine. Life in the orphanage also teaches her the value of simplicity taken to the extreme. Because in that environment, there are no superfluous ornaments, no extravagant lace or ostentatious colors, but rather pure lines, functionality, economy of resources. Paradoxically, what could have been experienced only as lack is transformed in her mind into an aesthetic code, almost into an aesthetic response to the excessive ornamentation that dominated the fashion of the era. While wealthy women of the Belle Époque entangle themselves in corsets, enormous skirts, and exaggerated decorations, Gabrielle becomes accustomed to radical sobriety and, without knowing it, begins to conceive the idea of a different elegance, based on visual cleanliness, comfort, and freedom of movement. The contrast between the world she aspires to and the world in which she lives becomes increasingly evident as she grows. On one side, the harshness of the orphanage, the repetition of routines, the authority of the religious women, the smell of wax and freshly washed fabric. On the other, the rumors and distant glimmers of a sophisticated France, with cafes full of intellectuals, theaters, cabarets, and women who can afford the luxury of worrying about fashion, art, or leisure. That distance, instead of paralyzing her, feeds her imagination, pushes her to make a silent promise to herself. Her story is not going to end there, in that cold building, sewing for others in the shadows. When she finally leaves the orphanage, she does not do so as a docile young woman resigned to the fate imposed on her, but as someone who has learned to observe, to remain silent, to wait for her moment, and to exploit any opportunity that presents itself. She has absorbed discipline, sobriety, and technique, but also a kind of quiet rage that drives her forward, a rage that will turn into ambition, into creativity, and into a constant need to prove that origin does not determine the ending. And it is precisely at that point, when she leaves behind the walls of Aubazine and faces for the first time a world that still sees her as small and insignificant, that the next stage of her life begins, the one in which she will discover that her voice can be heard from the most unexpected places. Coco is born on stage. Before becoming the woman who would dictate how half the world should dress, Gabrielle goes through a stage in which her greatest capital is not the needle or the thread, but her voice, her stage presence, and that strange mix of shyness and boldness that makes her stand out even when the stage is small and the audience is scarce. After leaving the orphanage, she comes into contact with a completely different environment. That universe of cafes, cheap performance halls, and barracks where soldiers seek quick entertainment, a refugee from boredom and military routine. and where she discovers that she can exchange something very valuable in return for attention, connections, and, little by little, a reputation. She works as a seamstress during the day, moving among fabrics of modest quality, mending, alterations, and commissions that rarely have anything glamorous about them. But when evening falls, the tone of her life changes. She prepares to step onto small stages in venues frequented by officers and young bourgeois men looking for distraction. And there, she sings light, catchy songs without great technical displays, but with an attitude that makes it clear she does not settle for being a simple ornament at the back of the room. She observes people with almost clinical precision, measures reactions, calculates which gesture works best, which look lingers a few seconds longer, which phrase sparks laughter or interest. In that context appears the nickname that will follow her forever: Coco. Some say it comes from a song she repeated on stage, "Qu'avez-vous, Coco?" Others claim it is a kind of affectionate diminutive invented by the men around her, easier to pronounce, more playful than Gabrielle. She cares less about the accuracy of the anecdote than about the effect of the name, short, sonorous, easy to remember, almost like a brand. There is something deeply entrepreneurial in the way she accepts that nickname. She understands that the public does not relate to complex, nuanced people, but to clear images, names that stick in the memory, characters that can be summed up in a single word. Every night, when she steps onto the stage in her simple dresses, still far from the sophistication her maison will later represent, she begins to practice something she will use years later in the world of fashion: the construction of a coherent character. Coco is independent, ironic, slightly distant, very aware of her power and, at the same time, desperately determined not to show the wound of the abandoned child. She understands that in those venues, no one comes to hear the complete biography of a singer. They come to be distracted, to project fantasies. And she offers herself as a screen onto which others can imagine, while inside she is making decisions that will bring her, step by step, toward a radically different future. The stages where she performs are modest, with dim lights and cigarette smoke floating in the air. Small tables, laughter, clinking glasses, and conversations that rise and fall in volume. But for her, they have the magnitude of an important theater, because there she faces a real audience for the first time, uncertain, volatile, capable of ignoring her or turning her into the center of the night, depending on the general mood. That risk forces her to develop a kind of courage that has nothing to do with physical strength, but with the ability to expose herself, to accept the possibility of rejection and, even so, step out to sing. In this continuous learning process, she also discovers something essential for any entrepreneur. She understands that talent, by itself, guarantees nothing. There are other women who sing, other girls who dance, other young presences ready to take her place if she fails one day, if she loses the rhythm, if she lets herself be crushed by comments or by the whims of the venue owner. This awareness leads her to take care of every detail, from the way she walks to the way she sits on the edge of the stage, from the selection of her songs to the way she relates to the most influential clients. Her image begins to become a strategic tool, something she sharpens and polishes with patience. Her relationships with the men she meets in these environments open doors that otherwise would have remained closed. Military men, young, wealthy men, heirs with more free time than responsibilities. Men accustomed to luxury who suddenly notice that slim girl with a direct gaze, who sings without shame but without vulgarity, who has the delicacy of a lady and the character of someone who has seen too much to be impressed by an elegant uniform. Through them, she gains access to other circles, other houses, other spaces where fashion is no longer something abstract and distant. but a very concrete instrument of class and power. In the hours she spends backstage, while waiting for her turn to perform, she entertains herself by observing the dresses of the women who attend the show, the exaggerated feathers, the tight corsets, the overloaded silhouettes. She sees how they move, how they sit with effort, how they breathe with difficulty, trapped in a structure that supposedly represents the ideal of femininity of the time. That observation does not yet turn into a manifesto, but it leaves a latent discomfort, a silent question that will accompany her for years. Why elegance has to be a form of prison for the woman's body. The money she earns singing is not enough to live in great luxury, but it does allow her something that for her has immense value: room to maneuver. She no longer depends solely on a sewing workshop or on anyone's charity. She begins to feel that her voice, her presence, and her character are monetizable assets, things she can take with her wherever she goes and with which she can negotiate. That change in perception is crucial because it breaks with a mindset of absolute survival and gives way to a broader ambition, the idea that her life does not have to be limited to accepting the role society has assigned to her. During this stage, she also learns to read the social codes of the upper class, even though she still observes it from the margins. She understands how they greet one another, what kind of jokes they make among themselves, which topics of conversation are considered refined and which are vulgar, how they dress to convey authority, seduction, or nonchalance. And with that information, she begins, almost without realizing it, to design in her head a different type of woman, a female figure that fits into those circles but is not subjected to their traditional rules. Her outsider perspective becomes a competitive advantage. She sees what those inside no longer question. It is important to understand that in these stages, the Chanel brand is not yet born. But the idea that identity can be manufactured, adjusted, and relaunched as many times as necessary does take hold. Coco gradually moves away from Gabrielle, from the weight of the orphanage, from visible poverty, to build herself as a character with her own aesthetic, with a particular way of speaking, walking, and occupying space. This awareness of image as a tool will be decisive when she begins to experiment with hats and garments, when she transforms that ability to dominate a stage into the skill of dominating a boutique. With the passage of time, that mix of disciplined seamstress and cabaret singer with commercial instinct will find a clearer channel. And the nights of light songs before soldiers and officers will remain as an early school of personal branding, mass psychology, and ego management. From there, the next move in her life will lead her to encounter new opportunities, calmer and quieter spaces, where the voice will cease to be the center of attention and the spotlight will shift to the way she dresses others and herself, opening the door to her first great entrepreneurial adventure. The first improvised sales. When Coco begins to frequent circles of military men, young heirs, and scattered members of the provincial bourgeoisie, she discovers that fashion is a language as powerful as music, and far more profitable if one knows how to interpret it intelligently. In those environments, where every detail of clothing sends a message about class, taste, and social position, she starts to notice what no one else observes, and to wonder why women resign themselves to wearing feathers that fall off, hats that block their view, or ornaments that weigh as if they were small suits of armor disguised as elegance. That aesthetic discomfort, which begins as a simple intuition, gradually turns into a real opportunity when her first wealthy friends begin to take an interest in the way she herself alters the clothes she wears. On days when she does not sing and her life seems like a succession of minor jobs with little chance of advancement, Coco begins to experiment through something she knows well: sewing. She takes ordinary hats, the kind sold in any haberdashery, and starts transforming them instinctively, removing decorations that seem excessive to her, changing proportions, raising or lowering the brim so that the piece flatters the face without becoming an obstacle. These small adjustments, apparently insignificant, create a surprising effect on those around her because the result does not stand out through excess, but through balance. Although she still has no boutique, no workshop of her own, nor a defined commercial plan, each of these modifications works as a kind of early successful prototype that attracts looks and comments. Some of the women she encounters in these social circles become intrigued by an aesthetic that does not respond to dominant trends. Because Coco does not try to impress anyone with feathers or giant flowers, but with a simplicity that seems almost provocative in an era dominated by excessive ornamentation. The same women who once laughed at her modest origins or her past as a singer are surprised when they discover that, by wearing one of those reworked hats, their appearance changes completely. They feel more refined, more modern, less trapped in a style that was already beginning to show signs of exhaustion. It is then that they begin to place improvised orders, first as a favor, then offering small sums of money, and finally as informal clients who come to her seeking something different from the usual. At this stage appears the figure of Etienne Balsan, a well-off man, owner of properties, a lover of leisure and horse racing, who notices Coco not only as a companion, but as someone with a restless spirit, incapable of being relegated to the role of a kept woman that so many accepted without a fight. He welcomes her into his environment, offers her lodging and financial stability, but also provides her with access to a world full of elegant women who arrive at his rural residences seeking rest and entertainment. These women, accustomed to luxury, become a perfect audience for Coco to test her ideas, because, without intending it, each of them functions as a walking showcase. Thanks to the freedom of movement she gains in Balsan's house, Coco begins to work more calmly, using scraps, ornaments, and materials she finds in the wardrobes and storage rooms of the property, creating pieces that are not born from formal research or a design school, but from the experience accumulated in the orphanage, constant observation in cabarets, and her own practical sense. Although she is still far from considering herself a designer, her creative process is surprisingly mature for someone without advanced technical training because it is not based on copying what already exists, but on reinterpreting it through comfort and visual cleanliness. The women who visit Balsan begin to ask for her hats, and each time one of them returns to Paris with a piece made by Coco, it creates a multiplying effect. Because there, in the capital of fashion, a novel detail draws attention very quickly, although at first no one knows who that young woman making minimalist and different hats is. The name of Coco begins to circulate among small groups of clients with their own criteria, who prefer something less overloaded than the usual trends. This organic, almost underground movement is the seed of her first real network of clients. At the same time, Coco observes the extraordinary contrast between the comfortable life Balsan offers her and the inner feeling that this position could vanish at any moment if she does not build something of her own. She knows that depending exclusively on a man is a form of instability disguised as security. And for that reason, she uses every free minute to work on her creations. Balsan, who feels flattered by her company, does not fully understand the intensity with which she throws herself into her work. But he does not oppose it either, because her hats bring a certain prestige and originality to the social environment in which they move. It is during this period that her vision begins to take shape. She understands that, to definitively escape the role of a kept lover, she needs to generate her own income and consolidate a commercial identity. even if she is not yet clear on how to do it formally. Sewing becomes a kind of bridge between the life she wants to leave behind and the one she aspires to create. And each hat she hands to a client is more than a handcrafted piece. It is a silent declaration that she is ready to begin a different path. That first flow of commissions, although irregular and fragile, is enough for Coco to begin dreaming of her own shop. A space where she does not depend on the hospitality of others, nor on the whims of the man who supports her. A place where her ideas can grow without asking permission. It is likely that at that moment, she still did not see the magnitude of what she was building. But she did have the certainty that, if she stayed still, her life would continue to be a story told by others. For that reason, among parties, horseback rides, and evenings at Balsan's house, her mind was always in motion, imagining new designs and new strategies. That inner impulse ends up leading her to a key decision: to distance herself, at least partially, from the comfort guaranteed by Balsan and move closer to the businessman Arthur Boy Capel, a man with a clearer vision of the potential that Coco carried within her. Although her relationship with Capel will develop later on, his presence begins to insinuate itself at this point as a decisive complement to her growth. Someone capable of seeing in her a businesswoman in potential, and not merely a woman with talent to entertain or decorate the lives of the rich. As these first improvised sales multiply, Coco begins to understand that her aesthetic intuition has real commercial value. Each satisfied client represents proof that there is an audience seeking something different, an aesthetic that does not yet have a name, but that begins to define itself with clarity. That conviction, together with her deep need for independence, will lead her to take the next decisive step, a step that will force her to risk more than anyone in her environment considers reasonable. And it will be precisely that leap, born from a mixture of ambition, nonconformity, and practical sense, that will lead her to open her first shop, beginning a stage in which she will go from selling individual pieces to building a style that will transform fashion forever. The boutique that changed everything. When Coco decides to make the leap from improvised commissions to her own space, the move seems reckless, even by the standards of a woman who is proud and accustomed to swimming against the current. Until that moment, her work moves through private salons, country residences, and intimate circles where her hats pass from hand to hand like small secrets shared among women who want to stand out without falling into a caricature of luxury. But she senses that, if she wants to stop depending on the will of a man and on temporary invitations, she needs an address, a door with her name on it, a place that identifies her before the world. From there comes the idea of settling in Deauville, a coastal city that in those years has become the great showcase of the French elite. A summer stage for aristocrats, wealthy bourgeois, hardened gamblers, and women who understand the summer season as a moving runway. Deauville is the ideal meeting point for anyone who wants to observe, sell, and position themselves in the minds of those who set trends without knowing it. Because there is concentrated a type of client who has time, money, and the desire to differentiate themselves. For an entrepreneur like Coco, that place is more than a pleasant destination. It is a perfect testing ground. Financing arrives, to a large extent, thanks to Arthur Boy Capel, who enters her life as a lover, companion, and above all, as someone who recognizes the commercial clarity behind her aesthetic intuitions. Capel does not see in her a passing distraction, but a woman with a sharp eye for detecting what is to come. And he decides to support her financially, even though from the perspective of many men of the time, that gesture seems like a romantic whim rather than a serious investment. Coco, however, knows that this support is an opportunity with an expiration date if she does not turn it into something profitable. So she takes every franc that comes in and every franc that goes out very seriously. The Deauville boutique is born almost as a logical extension of her own personality. A sober facade without stridency, clean shop windows, well-arranged pieces, and an atmosphere that moves away from the habitual Baroque excess of fashion shops. Whoever enters finds hats, accessories, and garments that seem simple at first glance, but that reveal extreme care in proportions, in details, and in the way they fall on the body. Coco applies a lesson learned in her childhood. Austerity can be elegant if it is handled with intelligence. Inside, she moves with a confidence that surprises those who knew her in the cabarets. Now she receives clients calmly, listens to them, analyzes their posture, the tone of their voice, their way of walking, and then proposes pieces that fit their lifestyle at the beach and in the city. The great innovation of this stage is the use of jersey knit, a fabric associated until then with underwear or with masculine and sporting attire, which no one considered appropriate for an elegant woman. Coco is fascinated precisely by that humble condition of the material, its ability to adapt to the body without constricting it, its flexible drape, and the freedom it offers to move naturally. When she designs those first sailor-style sets, straight-cut dresses, loose garments intended for walking along the seaside promenade without feeling the weight of the corset, she is doing something that goes beyond design. She is reinterpreting the concept of leisure and of femininity at the same time. Because the women who buy in her boutique no longer dress only to be observed. They dress to live their summer comfortably, to ride horses, stroll, board a boat, enter and leave cafes without having to think about whether the skirt catches or whether the corset prevents them from breathing. The Deauville clientele begins to take notice of this proposal with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. The women who dare to wear her garments discover that, far from subtracting glamour, that clean simplicity gives them a modern, efficient air, almost ahead of its time, as if they belong to a new generation that has left behind the ornamental excess of the Belle Époque. Little by little, the shop becomes a small center of pilgrimage for summer visitors who want to try something different from the overloaded repertoire of traditional fashion. From a business point of view, Coco observes each day as if it were a live market study. She takes mental note of which models sell quickly, which generate doubts, which colors work best with the light of the sea, how the public reacts to novelties, and with that information, she refines her offer, adjusts patterns, corrects details, and at the same time begins to shape a clear identity for her brand, even though she still does not conceive it in terms of logos or mass campaigns. Her competitive advantage is evident. She understands the real body of women, their practical needs, and their desire for style. And she negotiates among these three elements with an ease that few designers possess. Her relationship with Capel, for his part, provides her with more than initial capital. Her conversations with him, a man familiar with the world of business, of commerce, and of calculated bets, help her think in terms of risk and return, of expansion and consolidation. Capel believes in the profitability of female freedom translated into comfortable and elegant clothing, and this faith becomes an important moral support in moments of doubt. However, Coco never loses sight of a crucial detail. The project may have begun with another person's money, but it is being sustained by the response of the clients, and that is the true measure of her success. The social climate of the time adds an interesting layer to the context of the boutique. Shortly afterward, the First World War breaks out and European society enters a profound transformation, in which women join work and public responsibilities more directly, while men are at the front. Deauville feels that change, and the women who continue to pass through Coco's shop represent a less fragile, more active, and autonomous model of life. which makes her designs, already prioritizing comfort and functionality, fit almost perfectly with the new reality. The Deauville boutique thus becomes a laboratory where the future of the brand is tested, but also a school of management for Coco, who has to deal with suppliers, sizes, warehouses, outstanding accounts, and salaries. At the same time that she designs, she learns to be a businesswoman, controls cash flow, evaluates when it is advisable to produce more of a garment, and when it is better to maintain exclusivity, and discovers that her talent does not reside only in aesthetic taste, but in her ability to organize a business with rigor. The images of those seasons in Deauville help to understand why that small locale was much more than a summer shop. Women in light trousers, striped jerseys, jackets inspired by nautical attire, simplified hats that reveal the face, free silhouettes that move with the sea wind. Each of those seemingly small decisions gradually erodes the old model of feminine fashion. And in that erosion, a new canon of elegance is being built. When this stage is viewed with perspective, it becomes clear that Deauville is not simply a picturesque chapter in the life of Coco Chanel. It is the moment when her personal vision materializes into a coherent commercial proposal, where for the first time, her biography, her aesthetic, and her entrepreneurial spirit align. She has stopped being the young woman who sings in cabarets and makes hats by commission, to become the woman who directs her own space in which each garment responds to a clear idea of how the modern woman should dress. From here on, what began among discreet shop windows, the backdrop of the sea, and seasonal clients will become more solid and recognizable. And that style that takes shape day after day in that coastal city will begin to acquire a language of its own that will soon start to resonate far beyond Deauville, opening the way to a completely different way of understanding feminine elegance. A rule-breaking style. As the Deauville boutique begins to establish itself, what Coco offers stops being perceived as a seaside eccentricity and starts to become something with a very powerful internal logic, almost a philosophy of life translated into fabric, color, and form. Her clients leave the shop with the feeling that they have not dressed up to play a social role, but that they have found a way of dressing that respects their rhythm, their body, and their character. And that subtle change, which at first seems like a simple matter of comfort, ends up revealing a much deeper transformation, because it affects the way those women move, make decisions, and occupy space. In a world where femininity has been constructed for decades through tight corsets, enormous skirts, and almost theatrical decorations, Chanel proposes an aesthetic that seems to come from another time, or perhaps from a future where the woman's body is no longer subordinated to visual spectacle. Her lines are straight, her dresses fall effortlessly, waists stop being prisons of whalebone and wire, and excessive volume is reduced until it becomes a clean silhouette that moves naturally. What is revolutionary is not only the shape, but the intention. Clothing is no longer made to please the male observer, but to give the woman room to maneuver. Masculine inspiration runs through her work like a backbone that supports everything. Coco takes elements from the wardrobes of the men around her, from knitted sweaters to structured jackets or trousers for horseback riding, and adapts them to the female body without turning them into caricatures. She is interested in functionality, freedom of movement, the idea that a woman can walk down the street with a firm step without worrying about tripping over her own dress. While other designers continue to see fashion as a stage on which to display ornaments, she understands it as a tool for living better. Her color palette moves in the same direction. It breaks with the obsession for overloaded pastel tones, excessive patterns, and visual saturation, and clings to white, black, beige, navy blue, to sober combinations that in her hands are not boring, but forceful. Black, which until then had been associated almost exclusively with mourning or service, becomes a symbol of sophisticated elegance when she uses it in simple dresses, with pure lines, capable of working by day and by night with few variations. It is as if she had decided to distill fashion until only its essence remained, eliminating what is accessory so that what truly matters can be seen more clearly. The result of this aesthetic commitment is that the Chanel woman acquires a different presence without needing to raise her voice. She no longer needs to be wrapped in layers of fabric that shout luxury, because her authority is born from the serenity with which she moves, from the natural way she occupies her place at a table, in a living room, or on a crowded street. There is a coherence between clothing and attitude, and that makes her style immediately recognizable, even before the name of the brand has been institutionalized as a synonym for high luxury. To understand the impact of this turn, one has to imagine the reaction of society at the time. Part of the elite looks at her proposals with suspicion because it perceives in them a threat to the established order, to that idea of women as decorative figures wrapped in tulle and flowers. Another part, however, especially women who want a more active place in social and professional life, understands that Chanel offers them something no other fashion house has given them until then, a kind of soft armor that prepares them to work, travel, think, and decide without clothing becoming a constant obstacle. The Chanel style also works as a silent language among women. Those who wear her designs recognize one another as belonging to the same sensitivity, a diffuse but growing group that shares the idea that elegance does not have to be a Baroque spectacle, but rather an intelligent relationship between the body, the environment, and personality. Many clients, when looking at themselves in the mirror wearing one of her dresses, feel that they finally look the way they feel inside. Lighter, more practical, less subordinated to the judgment of others. Behind this refined aesthetic, there is a very personal trait of Coco: her contempt for what is unnecessary. Every button, every pocket, every seam has a reason to exist, a specific function, and if something does not add value, it is eliminated without remorse. This way of creating, which seems almost entrepreneurial, with a kind of obsession for efficiency, is deeply linked to her biography, to those years of orphanage and poverty in which any excess was an unthinkable luxury. What in her childhood was an obligation becomes, in her adult life, a conscious choice. As her reputation grows, so does the tension between what the market expects from a prestigious fashion house and what she is willing to offer. Many clients and critics of the time are more comfortable with ostentation because they associate it directly with price and status. They struggle to accept that something apparently simple can be more valuable than a dress loaded with details. And yet, the demand for her designs shows that there is a new generation of women who identify with that sober modernity. Coco remains firm in her intuition, convinced that true innovation is not negotiated according to public expectations, but imposed with coherence and courage. In her workshops, she does not behave like a capricious artist who leaves the material execution of her ideas in the hands of others. On the contrary, she reviews patterns, corrects cuts, adjusts lengths, tests on real bodies, listens to comments, and from all of that continues refining a visual vocabulary that becomes more precise every day. The discipline learned in the convent combines with the rigor of someone who knows that any mistake will be paid for dearly, both in reputation and in cash. Chanel understands that a solid brand is built from a coherent repetition of good decisions, and for that reason, she protects her style as one would protect the core of a business. And although her public figure begins to be surrounded by a certain aura of mystery and distance, deep down she is still the same woman who on stage learned to read people in a matter of seconds. She applies that intuition to her clients, detects their insecurities, their desires, and their fears, and proposes an image that strengthens them instead of exposing them. The Chanel style does not consist solely of wearing a particular dress. It consists of adopting a way of presenting oneself to the world without apologizing for existing. And that is one of the reasons why it ends up influencing feminine mentality as much as the fashion business itself. This new aesthetic language gradually gains ground, first in spa towns and summer cities, then in the streets of Paris, and later in other countries that look to France as an inevitable reference. What began as an almost silent break with traditional rules turns into an unstoppable current that redefines what it means to be well-dressed in the first decades of the 20th century. For Coco, who has always seen clothing as an act of personal construction, every woman who adopts her style is an ally, a proof that rebellion could become the norm. While this is happening, the outside world becomes more complicated. Political and social tension intensifies, and European history prepares to enter one of its harshest stages, a stage in which reality will force priorities to be adjusted and in which, unexpectedly, that functional and free style she has been developing will find a new meaning in the midst of conflict. Times of war and reinvention. When the First World War breaks out, the roar of the cannon seems distant in elegant salons and on the beaches of Deauville. But the impact arrives quickly and brutally, cutting back luxuries, emptying streets, sending men to the front, and forcing women to take on tasks that the system had previously denied them. The world that fed the frivolity of coastal summers begins to crack, and with it, the economic foundation that supported many businesses devoted to leisure and fashion starts to wobble. Chanel suddenly finds herself in the middle of a Europe that is changing priorities at full speed. And what for many marks the beginning of the end becomes for her a stopping point on the way to a new stage. The wealthiest clients travel less. It is no longer about showing off new dresses every season, but about finding ways to adapt to uncertainty, to care for their families, to take part in jobs they never imagined doing. Amid this collapse of privileges, Chanel watches closely and detects something essential for any entrepreneur. In times of crisis, the way of living transforms, and clothing must accompany that change if it hopes to remain relevant. War is not only a dramatic backdrop, it is also a force that drags old social codes with it and opens gaps for new customs. Deauville, which had been the perfect stage for the birth of her style, is affected by the drop in tourism and the general tension. But Coco does not remain paralyzed, counting losses. She prefers to think about how to move toward strategic places where her proposal can continue to grow. She decides to open a new house in Biarritz, a town less directly hit by the conflict and a refuge for wealthy families fleeing the noise of war without entirely giving up comfort. That move, which at first glance might seem risky, shows just how deeply she has understood that businesses do not survive if they cling to a single setting. In Biarritz, her clientele takes on a different tone. Traditional aristocracy mixes with new fortunes and with women who, although they still have resources, have been emotionally shaken by the war, have lost husbands, sons, brothers, or have them fighting at the front. And that changes what clothing means in their lives. They no longer seek only to dazzle at balls. They need to feel strong, functional, to wear garments that remind them they are still standing in the middle of a wobbling world. Chanel responds to that need by reinforcing the elements she had already been developing. Lightness, practicality, sober lines, comfortable fabrics, the scarcity of expensive materials, a direct consequence of the conflict. forces many designers to cut back their ambitions. But for her, it is almost a competitive advantage, because she feels comfortable working with more humble fabrics such as jersey, with cuts that make better use of pieces of cloth, with an ethic of economy that she had already absorbed during her orphanage years. Where others see limitations, she sees coherence with her visual discourse, a discourse that has never relied on ornamental excess as its sole argument. War, instead of suffocating her creativity, makes it more precise. A detail that defines this stage very clearly is the way she organizes her workshops. She hires many women who have lost their jobs due to wartime circumstances, offers them a salary and a space where their effort becomes something tangible and valuable. These workers do not sew purely festive dresses. They participate in the construction of a new female silhouette linked to work, autonomy, and everyday resistance. In some way, Chanel does not dress bodies alone. She also channels a new social reality in which women can no longer be reduced to a decorative role in the lives of men. The image of Coco in those years is that of a woman who, while the world bleeds, maintains an almost cold determination to keep moving forward. But behind that appearance, there is a very deep emotional component. She knows what it means to depend on circumstances beyond one's control. She lived it in childhood, and perhaps precisely for that reason, she resists letting the war write the entire script of her story. She adapts, she moves, she opens in another place, she changes production priorities, redesigns her imaginary clientele, and thus, step by step, turns external chaos into a series of calculated decisions. Aesthetically, her garments begin to acquire a different gravity. They are no longer only elegant and carefree summer outfits, but tools for a more sober and uncertain life. Skirts discreetly shorten to facilitate movement. Blouses become simpler and more resistant. Jackets draw inspiration from menswear in an even clearer way, with useful pockets and structures that support the body instead of constraining it. The implicit message is forceful. A woman must be able to walk, work, sustain a household, and face harsh news without clothing getting in her way. War accelerates something that had already been taking shape in the early decades of the 20th century: the entry of women into spaces previously closed to them. From factories to offices, from hospitals to volunteer organizations. This process, which carries a high emotional and human cost, reinforces the need for clothing suited to action. And Chanel becomes one of the few creators who understand early on that fashion, if it wants to survive, must adjust to this new female subject who writes letters, organizes supplies, tends to the wounded, and supports entire families. Meanwhile, on the sentimental front, her life is crossed by the intense and complex relationship with Boy Capel, who becomes a crucial figure in her business expansion, someone who, in addition to financial support, offers her a broader vision of the business world, of contracts, of the importance of structuring alliances properly. His presence gives her strength, but also introduces constant emotional tension. Because deep down, Chanel knows that depending completely on a man, even if she loves him, would betray that intimate promise she made to herself in the orphanage. The war, with its climate of urgency, amplifies this internal conflict between the need for support and the obsession with independence. It is during this period that the idea becomes consolidated that Chanel is not merely another dressmaker, but an architect of style who has correctly read the spirit of her time. In a scenario where many structures collapse, she offers an alternative that does not try to deny pain or decorate it, but to dress it with dignity, allowing women to sustain their new position in society with clothing that accompanies their rhythm instead of slowing it down. That alliance between historical context and aesthetic proposal is one of the great secrets of her success. Her style is not an isolated whim. It is a finely tuned response to the needs of her time. When the war ends, Europe emerges exhausted, with damaged cities, broken families, and unstable political structures. But from those ruins also arises a generation that has seen too much to want to return exactly to the previous world. Women who have worked, managed households, and made serious decisions look in the mirror and no longer recognize themselves in the old corseted silhouettes. Chanel, who has crossed the conflict with a stronger brand and a clearer vision, is ready to take advantage of this new scenario, in which urban life and the modernity of great capitals will demand more than summer improvisation and emergency adaptations. With that background, with a wartime experience turned into lessons on resilience, efficiency, and market awareness, the door opens to a different stage in which her name will stop being associated solely with elegant beaches and will begin to be inseparably linked to a very specific place in Paris, an address that will become the visible heart of her creative empire. The Parisian Empire takes off. When the war ends and Europe attempts to put its pieces back together, Paris begins to breathe again with a mixture of exhaustion and a desire for modernity. Like a city that has seen the worst and, precisely because of that, wants to live with greater intensity. It is in this context that the name Chanel stops belonging to elegant seaside resorts and summer destinations and becomes anchored to an address that would end up being legendary. Number 31, Rue Cambon. A building that is not simply a shop, but a physical manifesto of what Coco wants to build in the world of fashion. The choice of location is not accidental. It responds to that almost entrepreneurial intuition she has been refining over the years. Rue Cambon is close to Place Vendôme, surrounded by jewelry stores, luxury hotels, and high-level houses. An environment where the clientele she wants to conquer circulates. Women who have continued consuming fashion even in difficult times and who now seek a new form of elegance that allows them to express that they have survived the war with a different kind of strength. Coco understands that Paris is more than a city. It is a platform of legitimacy, and that whoever succeeds there ceases to be a promise and becomes a reference. The building on Rue Cambon is organized almost like a living organism, perfectly hierarchical. On the ground floor, the boutique, with its strategically sober windows, where ensembles, hats, and accessories are displayed without noise, trusting in the strength of their design. On the upper floors, the workshops, filled with focused seamstresses, mannequins, cutting tables, piles of carefully ordered fabrics, and that intense working atmosphere that blends the silence of concentration with the rhythmic sound of needles, scissors, and sewing machines. At the very top, her apartment, a space she does not use as a permanent residence, but which reflects her inner world, full of carefully chosen objects, mirrors, screens, sofas, a kind of intimate stage from which she contemplates her own empire. The famous mirrored staircase becomes a symbol of that place. From an intermediate point, semi-hidden, Coco sits to observe the fashion shows unfolding on the lower floor, reflected on multiple planes, without being fully seen by either clients or the press. It is a visual way of expressing something that has always defined her character, that controlled distance from which she directs, corrects, and analyzes, without mixing too much with the noise, but without losing a single detail of what is happening. For an entrepreneurial mind, that observation point is pure gold, because it allows her to understand the real impact of her creations on bodies, gestures, and gazes. On Rue Cambon, Chanel takes her vision to the next level, expanding the offering of the Maison far beyond day dresses and summer outfits. The collections include tailored suits, garments for urban life, light evening dresses, sophisticated knitwear, and, little by little, lines of accessories and costume jewelry that play with the idea that luxury does not necessarily have to be tied to excessively expensive materials, but rather to intelligent design and balance between proportions. She understands that a solid fashion house is not built solely from isolated garments, but from a complete universe in which every element, from the button to the necklace, responds to the same aesthetic logic. Her style finds a particularly strong echo in Paris because the city has changed after the conflict. The women who inhabit it no longer want to return to their previous lives as if nothing had happened. They have worked, taken responsibility for family businesses, demonstrated management capacity in the absence of men, and that experience is reflected in the way they look at fashion. Chanel offers them a way of dressing that legitimizes this new position, with suits that allow them to attend meetings, manage businesses, move from one neighborhood to another without feeling dressed up like fragile dolls. Clothing becomes an ally for their new life. The growth of the business requires an increasingly sophisticated organization. Coco transforms into a demanding director who controls production times, quality standards, suppliers, the training of her workers, and at the same time, the external image of the maison. There is a delicate balance between creative impulse and business discipline. On one hand, she needs to keep innovating, maintaining a fresh language, creating new silhouettes that make Paris talk. On the other, she knows that a brand does not survive without structure, without cost control, without clear systems of work. Rue Cambon is both an idea workshop and a small factory polished by the repetition of processes. The way she treats her team reflects her character. High demands, minimal tolerance for error, but also respect for the craft and the opportunity to learn. In a house where technical perfection is non-negotiable. Many of the women who work with her find in those workshops a place where they can develop valuable skills and have a stable salary in a still uncertain era. In her own way, Chanel builds a community of skilled labor that sustains every piece that comes to light in the presentation salons. International clientele begin to appear on Rue Cambon as the fame of the maison crosses borders. Actresses, foreign aristocrats, wives of major businessmen, women who travel to Paris to buy special dresses and who, upon returning to their countries, become involuntary ambassadors of the Chanel style. Every appearance at an event, every photograph in a newspaper, every comment within a privileged social circle contributes to consolidating the brand's reputation in places that Coco has not yet seen in person. The business becomes global without that word existing as we understand it today. Driven by conversations in salons, ships, and train stations. On a personal level, the weight of directing this expanding empire also transforms her. The girl from the orphanage, the cabaret singer, the young woman who began by modifying borrowed hats, now moves in a world in which she receives ambassadors, financiers, artists, and members of high society, yet maintains an inner distance that protects her from fascination with status. She never forgets that all of this could collapse if she stopped listening to her instinct and limited herself to pleasing the market, which is why she zealously guards her style, distrusts empty repetition, and prefers to take risks rather than become a caricature of herself. In parallel, she begins to play with the idea that a brand should not be limited to fabric and tailoring, but can expand into other territories of luxury, other sensory languages that reinforce the identity of the maison and accompany it where clothing does not reach. She understands that clothing is the visible skin, but that there are more subtle ways to remain in the memory of those who come into contact with her universe. This intuition will lead her to explore new terrain that she does not yet master, a territory in which she will have to learn to trust other experts without losing control of the central idea. while the staircases of Rue Cambon fill with clients, fabrics, and fitting sessions. Chanel begins to look beyond the mirror and to ask herself how to encapsulate that unmistakable style in something that can travel without taking up space in a suitcase. Something that leaves a trace in the air, even when the dress has already disappeared from the room, thus opening the door to the next great expansion of her creative empire. The birth of the eternal perfume. When Coco begins to dominate the Parisian landscape with her lightweight dresses and her vision reduced to the essential, she understands that a woman's presence does not end with the silhouette or the fall of a garment. There is something deeper, something invisible, that accompanies every movement and can be as powerful as a well-cut jacket. The trail she leaves in the air when she crosses a room. That instinctive perception, born from her sharp sense for reading human psychology, pushes her toward territory unknown to her. A fascinating realm because it demands creation through a language different from that of fabrics. The world of perfume. The interest in a fragrance of her own does not arise as a romantic desire or an aesthetic whim, but as a logical extension of her entrepreneurial identity. Chanel has built herself as a brand that proposes simplicity, modernity, and strength. And a perfume consistent with that vision can become the final mark that completes her universe. She understands that a luxury house is projected through multiple layers, and that whoever masters scent gains privileged access to the emotional memory of her clients. From there emerges the idea of creating an aroma that represents the modern woman who wears her clothes. To develop this fragrance, she comes into contact with Ernest Beau, an experienced perfumer trained between Russian and French traditions, a man capable of translating sensations into chemical formulas and aromatic accords that unfold in phases. As if they were small scenes within a single story, Beau presents her with several numbered samples, the product of a complex research process. And among them, there is one that surprises her with an unknown intensity. A blend in which aldehydes provide an almost abstract brilliance, a clean and enigmatic presence, capable of breaking with the excessive sweetness that dominated women's perfumes of the time. Coco immediately recognizes that it contains something that fits her philosophy. This aroma does not attempt to imitate natural flowers, nor hide behind a cloying identity. Its intention is to deliver a feeling of firm, modern, independent elegance. She decides that this will be the definitive essence, and that it will carry a simple, direct name, without conceptual ornamentation. Number 5. She chooses that name with the same logic with which she chooses a black dress, because she rejects the idea of disguising reality with unnecessary metaphors. The number speaks for itself. It is clear, geometric, easy to remember, impossible to confuse. In the presentation of this fragrance, Chanel once again demonstrates the strategic capacity that has accompanied her since her years as a singer. Instead of hiding innovation behind tradition, she displays it boldly, placing the bottle inside a transparent container with straight lines, a sober stopper, and a white label, as if it were a laboratory object transformed into a minimalist jewel. The decision is risky because the market is accustomed to elaborate packaging, curved figures, ornamental bottles that suggest luxury through decoration. But she prefers a bottle that embodies the essence of her style: precision, clarity, absence of visual noise. When the first vapors of the perfume begin to circulate through Parisian salons, the reaction is immediately polarized. Some find it strange, too modern, almost daring in its lack of floral intention, while others perceive in it a form of elegance that fits perfectly with the spirit of the times. In a world where women are beginning to have greater public presence, where they work, make decisions, and participate in social life with renewed strength, a perfume that does not seek to imitate delicate flowers, aligns with the discourse of autonomy that defines the era. The definitive impact arrives when Coco decides to present number 5 in her boutique on Rue Cambon. With a gesture that blends theatricality and calculated naturalness. She discreetly sprays the perfume throughout the store, impregnating fabrics, mirrors, and corridors, so that the clients who enter cannot avoid feeling that they are inside a different environment, almost intimate, as if the maison possessed its own essence that clings to the skin without asking permission. Instead of explaining long theories about the aroma, she allows the space to tell the story by itself. The perfume is not presented, it is experienced. The strategy works because it appeals to a very simple psychological mechanism. The women who visit the boutique want to take home a part of that experience, a piece of that atmosphere, an invisible trace of Chanel elegance. Number 5 suddenly becomes a symbol that transcends garments, a kind of emotional passport that connects clients with the identity of the maison, without the need to belong to the elite that purchases haute couture dresses. Thanks to this openness, Chanel ceases to be a luxury reserved only for those with access to exclusive garments, and opens itself to a broader audience, offering something accessible without sacrificing its essence. This move has profound business consequences because the perfume becomes a constant and scalable source of income, something no garment can guarantee due to the physical limits of manual production. A bottle can be replicated industrially without losing quality, and its distribution can expand beyond Paris, reaching cities and countries where Chanel clothing does not yet have a direct presence. The house stops being a business tied solely to the workshop and becomes an enterprise with the potential to grow across several markets at once. The success of number 5 also reveals a strategic facet of Coco that few had appreciated until then. Her ability to understand that the true permanence of a brand is built through products that function as emblems. A dress may remain in memory for a season, but a perfume stays on the skin, in homes, in intimate memories. She achieves what very few creators manage, creating something that becomes a cultural symbol before consolidating itself as a commercial product. The launch of number 5 coincides with a period in which Chanel already dominates the Parisian scene with confidence. And yet, the expansion of the perfume allows her to observe the world from a broader perspective, imagining a maison that does not depend solely on the rhythm of fashion, but can sustain itself thanks to products with a life of their own. This broad vision of business is one of the pillars that will allow the brand to survive crises, wars, and generational changes. From this moment on, every step the maison takes begins to be impregnated with the presence of this fragrance, because it becomes an emotional extension of her legacy. Actresses, writers, aristocrats, and women from different cities adopt number 5 as a symbol of modern sophistication. In some way, Chanel has achieved what so many brands pursue, transforming a product into a declaration of identity. With number 5 circulating around the world and establishing a new standard in the luxury industry, Coco finds herself in a privileged position to continue expanding her vision, because she no longer moves only among fabrics and patterns, but operates within a more abstract and powerful dimension, that of the collective imagination, the space where ideas become universal and brands are transformed into myths. And it is in the midst of that success, when the maison begins to expand with greater force, that her personal and professional life will face new tensions, shadows, and contradictions that will mark the next stage. Life between light and shadow. By this point, from the outside, Gabrielle Chanel's life appears to be a story perfectly charted toward success, a clean narrative of self-overcoming in which the girl abandoned in an orphanage ends up running one of the most influential maisons in Paris, settled in the Hotel Ritz, surrounded by luxury, mingling with artists, aristocrats, and financiers, always dressed with that air of apparent simplicity that, paradoxically, costs a fortune. However, behind that polished image there is an existence crossed by contradictions, wounds that never fully close, and decisions that reveal just how ambition, loneliness, and the need for control coexist within her in a permanent state of tension. Her daily life is divided between Rue Cambon and the Ritz, as if they were two sides of the same coin. In the Maison, she is the relentless director who corrects a hem, changes a row of buttons, opens a seam, and remakes an entire garment if something feels off. In the hotel, she moves through carpeted corridors, silent salons, and impeccably ordered rooms, an environment that symbolizes the social summit she has reached, but that at the same time has a quality of cold scenery, as if she were living on a stage that has to be dismantled every night. For many, staying at the Ritz is a dream. For her, as the years go by, it becomes a refuge where extreme comfort coexists with a loneliness that is difficult to confess. On the sentimental level, the figure of Arthur Boy Capel continues to cast a very long shadow over her life. Even after his death in a traffic accident that strikes her with unexpected violence, he was the one who believed in her talent as a businesswoman when she was still selling hats and sweaters in Deauville. The one who gave her financial stability and at the same time pushed her to think big, something that is rarely acknowledged fairly when her story is told. Capel's loss is not only the disappearance of a lover, it is the fall of a kind of strategic and emotional ally, someone who fit perfectly with that blend of romance and business that marked her so deeply. The news of the accident reaches her when her rise seems unstoppable, leaves her devastated, and from then on, work becomes even more a form of anesthesia. After Capel, other men enter her life, some with noble titles, others with political power, others with influence in the financial world, and all of them, to a greater or lesser extent, serve her as a way to negotiate positions, expand contacts, and reinforce her place within the European elite. However, none of them fully occupies the space left by that first great love. Chanel presents herself as strong, independent, sharp-witted, managing relationships with a pragmatism that disconcerts those who want to confine her to the role of a sentimental woman. But beneath that cold structure, there is a very deep fear of once again becoming emotionally dependent on someone who might disappear from one day to the next. Her close circle gradually fills with key figures from cultural life. Misia Serre, muse and hostess of half of the French artistic avant-garde. Jean Cocteau, poet and creator who draws her into theatrical projects. Composers, painters, dancers from the Ballet Russe. Chanel transforms herself into a patron, lends money, finances productions, designs costumes for plays and performances, and immerses herself in that ecosystem of creators who make Paris the epicenter of artistic modernity. This role as protector of the arts allows her to nourish another facet of her ego, that of a woman who not only becomes wealthy through fashion, but also drives culture forward and sets the tone of the era. However, her personality is neither gentle nor condescending. Her tongue is sharp, her irony can border on cruelty, and many of those around her learn that, in order to remain within her orbit, they must accept her mood swings, her silences, and her devastating remarks. Coco uses words as a weapon, as a defense, and as a way of marking distance. She mocks sentimentality, despises what she considers vulgar, ridicules those who cling to traditions she deems dead, and has no qualms about pointing out flaws of style in front of others. At the same time, she can show generosity at unexpected moments, helping indebted friends financially or supporting other people's projects, that she is unlikely to recover in financial terms. Another trait that emerges strongly during this stage is her tendency to rewrite her own biography. Little by little, she modifies details of her childhood, embellishing, omitting, changing dates, inventing versions more acceptable for the salons in which she now moves, as if she wanted to erase the trace of that past of poverty and abandonment that marked her so deeply. She speaks of a merchant father who left for America to make a fortune, softens the impact of the orphanage, attributes to herself more comfortable origins. It is not merely vanity. It is also a defense mechanism. The will to deny anyone the satisfaction of seeing her as a social climber, grateful for having been admitted into that world of elites. She needs to present herself as someone who was always destined for that place, even if she had to wrest it from fate. At the heart of the maison, her controlling character translates into an exhausting work rhythm. She reviews collections until the last minute, undoes what does not convince her, orders drastic changes in fashion shows, demands punctuality and loyalty, and creates an environment in which everyone knows that any mistake can have consequences. That harshness has a functional side. It guarantees a level of quality that turns Chanel into a synonym for perfection. But it also leaves behind exhausted employees, collaborators who admire her and fear her in equal measure, and a constant feeling that, in her world, affection is never completely separated from usefulness. In parallel, her relationship with money becomes increasingly complex. She has gone from absolute scarcity to managing significant sums, international contracts, and agreements with powerful partners. And among all of them, the Wertheimers stand out. The family of entrepreneurs who enter the picture to finance the production and distribution of Chanel No. 5. The agreement they sign grants them an enormous share of the profits, leaving Coco with a smaller portion than she feels she deserves. And that sense of having given up too much feeds a resentment that will become chronic over the years. The brilliant entrepreneur who had shown such instinct in managing her boutiques, makes, in the field of licenses, a move that she perceives as a strategic error, one she will try in vain to undo for decades. This conflict with the Wertheimers illustrates just how much Chanel's life is shaped by that mixture of clarity and momentary blindness that characterizes many great founders. She is capable of seeing the future of fashion with an almost prophetic clarity. But she underestimates the long-term impact of certain legal agreements. And when she wants to undo them, she finds herself trapped in a corporate structure she no longer fully controls. That limitation wounds her pride deeply because she does not conceive of herself as a piece within a system, but as the mind that originated everything. In her private life, loneliness returns again and again, disguised as independence. She takes pride in not having married, in not having been relegated to a domestic role. She takes pride in having created a name of her own that is worth more than many illustrious surnames. But when night falls, in the perfect rooms of the Ritz, absence weighs heavily. Capel's death continues to surface like a scar. And the noise of the salons, which distracts her during the day, is no longer enough to silence a certain underlying melancholy. To endure it, she always returns to the only thing that has never betrayed her: work. When something hurts, she throws herself into a collection, corrects a sleeve, reviews a perfume, argues over a budget. All of these lights and shadows shape a woman who moves through life with a mixture of calculated coldness and hidden vulnerability. Someone who promotes a strong and modern form of femininity, but who carries very ancient fears. A character molded by the lack of stable love and by the need to prove, again and again, that no one is going to send her back to the place she came from. Meanwhile, Europe slowly begins to darken once more. Amid crises, national resentments, and speeches that grow like a silent threat, preparing the stage for a new conflict that will put to the test not only her business and her reputation, but the entire structure of power and relationships upon which she has built her adult life. The war that almost destroyed her. When Europe plunges fully into the Second World War, the cultural and economic climate that had allowed Chanel to expand freely unravels like a fabric too delicate, subjected to a sudden pull. The streets of Paris begin to fill with soldiers, conversations grow shorter and more tense, and businesses, including fashion maisons, watch as the flow of wealthy, carefree clients dwindles until it almost disappears. The city that had been synonymous with creativity, sophistication, and nightlife is reborn as a gray landscape, marked by curfews, scarcity, and fear. Chanel, already an established figure within the Parisian elite, observes this scene with a mixture of disbelief and pragmatism. For a woman accustomed to directing her life with a firm hand, the eruption of conflict represents more than a business crisis. It is the reappearance of a deep fear of losing control, that control she has fought so hard to conquer since her youth. Suddenly, things no longer depend on her ingenuity or discipline, but on immense historical forces sweeping across Europe with a brutality few generations have known. With the German advance into France and the subsequent occupation of Paris, the situation becomes even more delicate. In that context, Chanel makes a decisive choice that surprises many. She closes her maison. More than 4,000 employees are left without work from one day to the next, and the Parisian fashion industry receives the blow with astonishment. She justifies the decision by saying that in times of war, there can be no luxury, that fashion must stop until the country regains its stability. But behind that stance, several motivations can be sensed, some of them charged with personal tension and resentment. For years, she has carried on a silent battle against the Wertheimer family, the partners of the No. 5 perfume, and she sees in the war an opportunity to reposition herself legally and recover control of a business she feels was taken from her by an unfair contract. The anti-Semitic laws established during the German occupation open a dark door that Chanel, in a gesture that decades later will be harshly questioned, tries to use to her advantage. The Wertheimers, of Jewish origin, have left France to safeguard their security and have placed the company under foreign jurisdiction to protect it. Chanel attempts to invalidate those moves and claims full control of the company that produces her perfume. This episode, about which she never spoke openly, casts a permanent shadow over her figure because it shows the extent to which war can bend the principles of someone who built her reputation on freedom, independence, and elegance. Alongside this business maneuver, her personal life becomes dangerously entangled with the German occupiers. Taking up residence at the Ritz during the occupation, she lives in the same space where many German officers are lodged. Among them, the officer Hans Günther von Dinklage, with whom she maintains a close relationship. That relationship, marked by interests, convenience, and perhaps also by a complex need for protection, becomes a delicate piece in the puzzle of her reputation. Although she can justify herself by saying that, in times of war, survival takes unexpected forms, the reality is that the line between personal strategy and collaboration becomes blurred. In that occupied Paris, where every gesture could be interpreted as betrayal or resistance, Chanel becomes trapped in a web of suspicions and rumors. Some see her as an opportunist who adapts to whoever holds power. Others as a woman trying to survive in a dangerous environment. And others simply as someone who has lost her way in the midst of a historical storm. What is certain is that her relationship with von Dinklage brings her closer to circles of influence that move between diplomacy, espionage, and political ambiguity. A terrain for which Coco has neither preparation nor deep conviction, but in which she ends up operating through a mixture of pride and circumstance. Her participation in an operation known as Counterpoint Model, in which she supposedly attempts to mediate a negotiation to end the war between Germany and Great Britain, adds another confusing chapter to her activities during those years. It is not known with certainty whether she acted out of naivete, ambition, or a desire to recover some form of prominence in a convulsed world. But the episode shows her far from her natural territory, involved in political maneuvers very distant from fashion salons and the staircases of Rue Cambon. The war drags her into a realm where nothing is under her control, where the risks are extremely high, and where her public image is exposed to judgments she will never be able to fully correct. The occupation ends in 1944, and with the liberation of Paris comes a wave of purges, investigations, and reckonings. Many people who lived alongside the Germans face sanctions, public humiliations, or judicial proceedings. Chanel, for her part, is interrogated, but surprisingly does not receive formal charges. Several historians point out that she may have been protected by powerful influences, perhaps British, due to the diplomatic relationships she had woven during the war. What is certain is that, although she avoids legal condemnation, she does not escape social judgment. Her image is marked even among those who had admired her for years. Public discomfort, emotional exhaustion, and the deterioration of her reputation push her to withdraw from France. She takes refuge in Switzerland, far from Parisian noise, far from headlines, far from the political tension that continues to linger in Europe. There she spends several years trying to rebuild her inner stability, thinking about what she has lost and about the feeling of having been trapped in a war she did not know how to read in all its depth. She leaves Rue Cambon behind, disconnected from the maison, isolated from her own empire, almost as if she had been exiled from her own name. During that prolonged retreat in Switzerland, the perfume business continues to prosper without her, further reinforcing the idea that the contract with the Wertheimers was a mistake she cannot undo. The paradox is cruel. While her reputation wavers, the product that bears her surname crosses borders, settles on vanities around half the world, and grows stronger as a symbol of prestige. Chanel watches from a distance as her most famous creation continues to grow without the need for her daily presence. And that situation both frustrates her and pushes her to imagine a return. In those dark years, as Europe tries to recover and Chanel retreats into an almost monastic silence, the conviction gradually takes shape within her that her story cannot end there, in Switzerland, with a melancholic retirement. The woman who had survived the orphanage, poverty, world war, moral judgments, and her own mistakes was not willing to accept an old age consigned to oblivion. And that conviction, which has nothing of nostalgia and much of pride, will be the spark that pushes her toward one of the most unexpected turns in her biography. Exile, silence, and inner rage. Far from the noise of Paris, settled in discreet hotels and residences in Switzerland, Coco Chanel faces something that the war had not managed to make her feel with such rawness. The sensation of irrelevance, of being left on the margins of history when she still feels she has the energy to influence it. Post-war Switzerland is orderly, clean, neutral, a place where time seems to move at a different speed. And in that landscape so unlike the Rue Cambon, she walks in her sober suits, her pearl necklaces, her sharp gaze, and sees herself as a kind of voluntary and at the same time forced exile. A woman who built an empire in a city from which she is now practically absent. The years immediately following the conflict find her tired, surrounded by rumors about her relationship with the Germans, with her reputation damaged, and with a mixture of wounded pride and exhaustion that makes withdrawal seem, at first, like a reasonable option. She surrounds herself with a small circle of friends, maintains a certain correspondence, continues to receive news from Paris, but she no longer sets the pace of fashion. The woman who for decades lived in constant motion among fabrics, workshops, and runway shows is forced to look at herself in the mirror without the noise of daily production. And that silence is more intimidating than any bombardment. Meanwhile, in the French capital, the system she helped transform moves forward without waiting for anyone. And in that new scene, a name begins to stand out that irritates and challenges her in equal measure. Christian Dior. His famous new look, with defined waists, full skirts, and a return to the exuberance of femininity built on volume, conquers the press and the clientele, giving back to the woman's body a silhouette that Coco considers a step backward. From a distance, she looks at photographs of those dresses and feels that the effort of her entire life, that struggle to free women from textile armor, is being challenged by a wave of elegant nostalgia that, for her, feels almost like a betrayal. Fashion magazines celebrate Dior as the great resurgence of Parisian chic. Newspapers write about a new era. Clients once again embrace the idea of a spectacular femininity centered on the wasp waist. And Chanel, already over 60 years old, reads those headlines with a frown, biting her cigarette in anger. She feels like a retired general watching others redraw the map of a territory she once conquered. And the idea of becoming a museum figure, a respected but frozen name, irritates her more than any criticism. In Switzerland, far from the Rue Cambon, money keeps coming in. The perfume sells, the coffers fill, the Wertheimers, whom she had tried to wrest control from during the war, return and intelligently reorganize the business, ensuring that Chanel No. 5 continues to grow and penetrate new markets. Paradoxically, she is richer than ever. Yet at the same time, she feels less in control of her destiny. The income she receives allows her to live without economic concern. But her entrepreneurial pride is splintered, because she knows that the financial engine of her name is in the hands of others. With the passage of time, and after discreet negotiations, she eventually reaches an agreement with the Wertheimers that guarantees her a life of abundance, a kind of belated arrangement that softens the original grievance. She secures a more advantageous position. But even so, the thorn of that contract signed years earlier does not disappear from her memory. Chanel is one of those people who remember every concession they were forced to make, and the feeling of having ceded power continues to feed a deep dissatisfaction, even if outwardly she appears dignified and seemingly indifferent. In the midst of this strange balance between material wealth and moral exile, her character becomes even sharper. Her comments are briefer, her patience shorter, her opinions about the post-war world harsher. She speaks with contempt of the new look, criticizes the return to excessive use of fabric, mocks strangled waists, considers that this return to pomp is an illusion destined to disappear as soon as economic reality reasserts itself. At the same time, fashion continues to move forward without consulting her, and that movement begins to corner her internally. Either she accepts watching from the sidelines, or she dares to return to a playing field that is no longer waiting for her. Her daily life in Switzerland has something of a mechanical ritual to it. Walks, punctual visits, readings, conversations with acquaintances who treat her with reverential respect, as one treats a living legend, and who, perhaps without intending to, reinforce the idea that her time has passed. That label of legend is a double-edged sword because it contains both praise and condemnation. What you did is admired, but it is suggested that what you could still do is no longer necessary. Chanel, who has built her entire identity on action and control, cannot fully tolerate that narrative. Inside her, the orphanage girl who swore she would not let others decide for her is still very much alive. And that girl rebels against the idea of retiring in a foreign country, surrounded by order and silence, while Paris reinvents its glamour without her voice. The rage she feels, far from destroying her, begins to turn into fuel. A rage that mixes guilt over mistakes made during the war, resentment toward a fashion world that leans toward other creators, and wounded pride over the way she has been judged and pushed aside. There is something deeply human at this point in her story. A woman who has known extreme success, who has enjoyed power, influence, and fame, suddenly finds herself at an age when many resign themselves. And yet, instead of settling into nostalgia, she realizes that the only way to reconcile with herself is to return to doing what she knows best. It is no longer about money, nor social recognition, nor even competing with Dior or anyone in particular. It is about proving to herself that her gaze is still valid, that her instinct has not rusted, that her way of understanding the female body can still be relevant in a world different from the one that saw her born as a designer. As she reflects on this, Paris, with its lights and its chaos, is only a few hours away by train, too close to ignore its call. News about the new consumer society, about women who work and go out, about American cinema and the stars who influence the way people dress, reaches her as a constant reminder that fashion is a language that does not stop, and that perhaps she still has something important to say. Every time she sees a photograph of a woman wrapped in meters of fabric, with a rigid waist and a restrained expression, something inside her protests. In that tension between the comfort of exile and the discomfort of oblivion, between guaranteed wealth and creative emptiness, the decision begins to take shape that many would consider imprudent for someone of her age. To return to the center of the scene, to risk what remains of her reputation, to face new generations of critics and clients, to place herself once again under the merciless light of the shop windows of Paris, and to find out in front of everyone whether her name still means something more than an immortal perfume. And when that idea ceases to be a fantasy and becomes a plan, the story of Chanel enters an unexpected phase that proves that, in her case, withdrawal was never a definitive option. The unexpected return. When Chanel decides to return, Paris is no longer the same city she left behind when she departed for Switzerland. But neither is she the same woman, even if she keeps the same haircut, the same strict suits, and that tight-lipped expression that no one manages to imitate. She's over 70 years old, an age at which, for almost everyone, the time for risks has passed. And yet, while many consider her a retired legend, she looks at the fashion landscape and feels something close to indignation, a mixture of surprise and anger at seeing how the female body has once again been trapped by tiny waists, wide skirts, and structures that require meters of fabric, precisely what she had fought against decades earlier. The journey back to Paris is not a nostalgic stroll to reunite with old friends. It is a surgical operation, cold and calculated, in which she knows her legacy is at stake. She returns to the Ritz, returns to the Rue Cambon, returns to the spaces that saw her reign and fall. And instead of hiding behind the excuse of age, she enters with the intention of taking back command. The Wertheimers, who have consolidated the perfume business while she was away, understand that the name Chanel still has immense power if it is accompanied by a living presence, and after years of disagreements and legal battles, they become decisive allies in financing the rebirth of the maison. It is a strange alliance, built on past resentments, but functional. They provide capital, structure, and a distribution network. She delivers her vision, her character, and the symbolic force of her signature. Reopening the haute couture house after 15 years out of the game involves something far more complex than simply lifting the shutter of a shop. It is necessary to recruit a team again, to train young hands that have never worked under her discipline, to rebuild workshops, reactivate suppliers, recover clientele, and above all, to design a collection that makes sense in a decade marked by television, cinema as a global phenomenon, and a new generation of women who have grown up far from the Belle Époque. Chanel plunges into the work with the same intensity with which, in her youth, she reshaped hats in the country houses of her wealthy lovers. But now, with a different urgency, aware that the world is watching her under a magnifying glass. The first weeks are ones of silent observation. She walks through Paris, examines shop windows, flips through magazines, analyzes how women dress in the street, office workers, actresses, the wives of businessmen, young women who are beginning to study and imagine more autonomous lives. Her conclusion is clear and devastating. She believes that fashion has once again fallen into the trap of decorativism, into the fantasy of the ornamental woman dressed for grand salons that no longer represent the center of social life. Convinced that the future still lies in freedom of movement, in pure lines, and in effortless elegance, she decides that her return will not consist of adapting to the reigning new look, but of opposing it head-on. On the day of the comeback show in 1954, the Rue Cambon fills with a mixture of onlookers, press, and old acquaintances. There is anticipation, but also a certain morbid curiosity, the desire to see whether the former queen of fashion has remained frozen in her ideas or whether she will be capable of speaking the language of the new era. Chanel, dressed in an almost uniform manner, with her habitual short jacket, straight skirt, and pearls, watches from the famous mirrored staircase as her models begin to emerge. Skirts below the knee but without excessive flare, fitted jackets without theatrical rigidity, lines that follow the body without strangling it, supple tweed fabrics, soft tones, practical pockets, a silhouette that breathes. The immediate reaction of the French press is merciless. Many critics accuse her of repeating outdated formulas, of proposing clothing for ladies in an era in which fashion seeks spectacle, explosive novelty, and dramatic gestures. They compare her unfavorably with Dior and other creators of the following generation, present her as a woman who has returned too late, who does not understand the passion for volumes that dominate the salons. For a proud personality like hers, reading those reviews is like receiving a series of public slaps. However, she does not collapse. She knows that the true opinion that interests her is not in the newspaper columns, but in the response of the women who dress and move in real life. And the surprise arrives precisely from outside France. While Parisian critics entertain themselves by dismantling her collection with sharp words, buyers from the United States, more pragmatic, more attentive to the rhythm of the street than to the tradition of French chic, see in those suits something extraordinarily contemporary. They understand that these clothes work for women who work, who travel, who attend meetings, and who need a style that can withstand hours of activity without losing dignity. Stores in New York begin to place orders. North American magazines look at her with different eyes. And clients who already knew the name Chanel through the perfume discover that the woman behind the fragrance has returned to design with ideas that connect with modernity. This difference in reaction between local criticism and the international market reinforces a key business lesson that she, even without theorizing it, embodies clearly. Success does not always come from the place where one expects to be validated. Chanel could have been crushed by Parisian mockery, but she decides instead to listen to the women who try on her suits and do not want to take them off. To the buyers who come back for more models, to the executives and actresses who find in her tweed jackets something they have not seen in any other house. Slowly, that voice of the street and of external markets begins to silence the noise of the first criticisms. In the workshops, the working atmosphere intensifies. She, despite her age, continues walking among the tables, touching the fabrics, correcting shoulders, shortening sleeves, fitting the suits on the models themselves to check that they can raise their arms, sit down, climb stairs without the garment losing its line. She is not designing for static mannequins. She is thinking of women in motion. That obsession with functionality, which many had taken for simplicity, reveals itself as an advanced way of understanding the relationship between fashion and everyday life. At the same time, the return stirs old tensions in her character. The tone of her comments remains harsh. She continues to demand absolute concentration from the team. She still has little tolerance for error. But there is something different, perhaps more urgent, in her way of directing. She knows that time is limited, that this stage cannot be prolonged indefinitely, and for that reason, she compresses her energy, as if each collection were a kind of living testament, a way of making her position clear in the face of fashion history. As the seasons following her return advance, perception changes. Critics who had dismissed her begin to soften their judgments. Some quietly retract, others openly praise her when they see that clients return, that her silhouette of a short jacket and straight skirt begins to be recognized as the basis of the modern woman's wardrobe. Chanel demonstrates, with this late return, that long-term coherence can outweigh fleeting fashion, and that a style deeply rooted in a vision of the world ends up imposing itself over trends that change every few years. In parallel, outside the runways, images of influential women dressed in her suits travel the world. Actresses, first ladies, public figures adopt the tweed ensemble as a uniform of sober elegance, and that image fixes itself in the collective imagination. What began as a return filled with doubts transforms into the definitive consolidation of an icon. The public perceives that Chanel has returned, but not to imitate the past, rather to reaffirm, in a new context, the same idea that had guided her since Deauville. The woman is not made to be an immobile mannequin, but a character with a life of her own. With this ground recovered, with the Maison once again in motion and her name back on everyone's lips, no longer as a relic, but as an active presence, the stage is set for a specific creation to become the perfect synthesis of her philosophy. A garment that will enclose within its structure everything Coco had wanted to say from the very first day about freedom, elegance, and female power. The suit that redefined modernity. Among all the codes that Coco had been planning throughout her career, there was one that had not yet reached its definitive form. A kind of latent idea that crossed her admiration for menswear, her obsession with comfort, and her intuition that the modern woman needed a new uniform, something she could wear almost like a second skin, recognizable in any context, from an office to a restaurant, from a train journey to an official reception. From that intersection of needs and memories, in the full maturity of her return, the tweed suit emerges, a creation that seems simple at first glance, but hides an almost architectural complexity when one stops to observe it calmly. Tweed, a fabric traditionally associated with the countryside, with riding outfits, with the sturdy jackets of British men who endure wind and rain, has fascinated her for some time because of its texture, its resistance, and the way it can adapt to different climates without losing dignity. Chanel sees in that material something that fits her idea of an active woman, one who moves, travels, works, and she decides to tame it for the female body, stripping it of rigidity, refining its weight, softening the colors, until it becomes a fabric that embraces, supports, and accompanies without imposing itself like a heavy armor. The tweed jacket she begins to design is not born from an isolated drawing on a table. It is born from the bodies of the women around her. It is tried again and again on models. The length is adjusted so that it is comfortable when sitting. The shoulders are corrected to give presence without turning the wearer into a martial figure. Pockets are added where hands naturally seek to rest or store something. The placement of each button is calculated with precision so that the garment closes with ease. Everything about it is designed so that a woman can move for hours without remembering that she's wearing something valuable, and at the same time so that every gesture is framed by a clear, firm, elegant line. One of the most revealing details, which shows to what extent Coco thinks in terms of engineering clothing, is the lining and the small weight that runs along the hem of the jacket. Instead of letting the garment depend only on its visual weight, she secures its fall by sewing a fine inner chain that helps the fabric stay in place, that prevents it from shifting in a disorderly way when the woman walks or crosses her arms. It is an almost invisible gesture for someone wearing it for the first time. But once that sensation of stability is felt, it becomes difficult to return to anything else. Luxury, in her language, is measured in the well-resolved centimeters, in discrete solutions that the eye may not see but the body appreciates. The ensemble is completed with a straight skirt of measured length, designed to accompany movement without drawing attention to itself, to lengthen the figure in a natural way without unnecessary volume. The strength of the suit lies in the dialogue between both pieces, in the way the jacket frames the upper body and the skirt functions as a silent support for the entire silhouette. There is no drama in the pattern. There is logic, discipline, and a deep respect for the real bodies of women. Chanel refuses to design for an abstract ideal that exists only on magazine pages, and that is what makes her suit feel close, almost inevitable. The colors and fabrics she chooses for her tweed suits do not respond to seasonal whim either. They are conceived to endure. Plays of powdered tones, grays, beiges, soft pastels interwoven with threads of other shades. Textures that allow the richness of the fabric to be seen without turning it into a strident spectacle. The result is a garment that can accompany a woman for years without becoming outdated, that lends itself to being combined with different accessories, blouses, jewelry, and that tolerates small transformations without losing its essence. In business terms, it is a masterstroke. She creates a piece that invites repetition, to owning more than one version, to building almost a small wardrobe around it. The reception of the suit in society is gradual, but relentless. At first, some see it as too sober, too severe compared to the exuberance that still dominates certain parties and salons. However, the rhythm of urban life and the growing presence of women in professional spaces make that ensemble so functional and elegant. The perfect ally for meetings, business trips, working lunches. It does not take long for it to appear in photographs of actresses, in embassy armchairs, in airports, in the corridors of luxury hotels. And each of those appearances reinforces the idea that this suit has come to stay. One of the keys to the impact of the tweed suit is that it does not try to hide the authority of the woman who wears it under a layer of romanticism. On the contrary, it underscores it with delicacy. The jacket, precisely structured, with its pockets and trims, frames the torso as if drawing a contour of security. something that is especially noticeable in photographs of women of political and social power in the middle of the 20th century. They sit with straight backs, rest their elbows, cross their legs, and the jacket supports all that gesture without losing its shape. It is a uniform of influence without being military, an outfit for work without losing femininity. In that suit, much of Chanel's biography is condensed. The discipline of the convent in the cleanliness of the lines, the functionality learned from menswear, the reaction against the corsets and heavy skirts of her youth, the experience of war that taught her to value resistant materials, and the entrepreneurial vision of a woman who knows that the true revolution lies in repeating an idea until it becomes canon. Every time someone refers to a tailored suit as a synonym for elegant female authority, they are, even without knowing it, quoting Chanel. The success of the suit also has an effect on the image of Coco herself, who in her later years appears almost always wearing variations of the same uniform. Light or dark tweed jacket, straight skirt, simple blouse, pearl necklaces that break austerity with a touch of controlled shine, two-tone shoes that refine the foot and allow walking for hours. She presents herself to the world dressed as herself, embodying her own design. And that coherence reinforces the message that she is not selling an external fantasy. She is sharing the way in which she herself has decided to inhabit her body and her time. The tweed suit eventually acquires an intergenerational dimension. Different women inherit it, alter it, adapt it, combine it with new garments, and yet it retains its character. It survives changes in fashion, the birth of new haute couture houses, the arrival of designers who propose more strident ruptures, and still it remains there, at the foundation of the wardrobe of many women who need a reliable garment when it is time to face the public. Chanel, who always distrusted the ephemeral, achieves with this design something very few have managed: to create a timeless piece without making it neutral, charged with meaning, yet free of artifice. With the suit already established as a symbol of her creative resurrection and as a perfect summary of her way of understanding elegance, Coco's life enters a final phase in which creation and routine walk hand in hand, and in which her relationship with time, work, and the idea of legacy becomes increasingly intense, preparing the stage for final years in which she will continue directing her maison with the same obstinacy with which she once clung in her youth to the idea of not leaving her destiny in anyone else's hands. The final years on Rue Cambon. In the final stage of her life, Coco Chanel continues to move every morning from her suite at the Ritz to number 31 Rue Cambon with the same determination with which, decades earlier, she walked the streets of Deauville carrying hats under her arm. The difference is that now her figure, always dressed in her uniform of tweed jacket, straight skirt, pearls, and two-tone shoes, advances surrounded by an almost mythological aura, as if the city recognized her in silence, aware that it is witnessing the steps of someone who has forever marked the visual identity of entire generations. Despite her old age, her pace is surprisingly steady, and those who work with her know that there is no valid excuse for being late when the director crosses the workshop door. The routine in the maison follows an order that no one dares to alter. Chanel reviews fabrics, analyzes sketches, corrects patterns, touches seams with the tips of her fingers, as if she could detect microscopic errors without needing to see them. She watches the models walk through the salon with the surgical attention of someone listening to a melody and catching the off-key note in the middle of a choir. Age has not weakened her ability to perceive details that others would overlook. And that sensitivity is one of the reasons why, even in her final years, the brand remains a benchmark of precision and stylistic coherence. The team around her has grown accustomed to her character, to that complex mix of sporadic affection and verbal cruelty that can dismantle anyone in a matter of seconds. There are days when she offers brief compliments, almost murmured, and others when she destroys a garment with a wave of her hand and a cutting phrase, demanding that everything begin again from zero. Those who know her well claim that this temperament, far from softening with age, has become sharper, perhaps because she feels the weight of time and the urgency of not allowing anything that bears her name to fall below her standards. For her, legacy is not an abstract word. It is every seam, every shoulder, every button. Despite worldwide fame, she remains detached from social spectacle, avoids major events, does not attend parties, does not grant lengthy interviews, and rarely smiles in public. She prefers the silence of the workshop, the sound of scissors, the scent of freshly cut fabrics, the reflection of the mirrors on Rue Cambon, where her figure and that of her models multiply. In that enclosed space, where outside visitors enter almost reverently, Chanel feels alive, active, necessary. And that feeling has become a kind of engine that pushes aside the fragility of old age. Her relationship with the Ritz, which for many symbolizes absolute luxury, has a more intimate background. It is the place where she takes refuge from the outside world, where every object is exactly where it should be, where the staff treats her with the deference she demands, where she can rest without facing the discomfort of a real house. Chanel never felt the need to own a home of her own. The hotel offers her the emotional neutrality she requires, a kind of rootless territory from which to control her life without feeling that she belongs anywhere. This permanent distance from the traditional idea of home is one of the many shadows she carries from childhood, a wound that never fully closed. During this period, the Maison faces changes in the industry. New houses emerge, new designers seek to capture the attention of the press. Youth wants bolder novelties, but Chanel does not compete on that ground. She is not interested in stridency or rupture for the sake of rupture. She trusts in the solidity of her style, in the disciplined repetition of her principles, in the power of a well-constructed idea to cross decades without losing meaning. Critics, who attacked her harshly upon her return, now acknowledge that her coherence has become an unquestionable value in a world where trends change at dizzying speed. As she grows older, she becomes more reflective at certain moments, although she rarely allows that vulnerability to become visible. Some testimonies from those close to her assure that there were afternoons when she sat alone in the fitting salon, observing the mirrors as if she were reviewing her own life with the same severity with which she reviewed a poorly cut skirt. In those silent pauses appears a woman who still feels the weight of past decisions, the mark of lost loves, the shadow of war, the discomfort of a biography reinvented 1,000 times, but who nonetheless chooses to keep working because she knows that creation is her only way to remain standing. Her fame is worldwide. Her suits have become synonymous with elegance. Her perfume is the best-selling of the century. And yet, she does not lose that critical attitude toward everything, including herself. She utters forceful phrases that later become celebrated quotations, many of them spoken without any intention of transcendence, such as when she states that fashion is not something that exists only in dresses, but something that is in the air, in the street, in ideas, in the way we live. That ability to simplify profound concepts into apparently simple sentences is one of the keys to her magnetism. In these final years, Coco's figure acquires a ceremonial dimension within the Maison. When she enters the workshop, the atmosphere changes. Seamstresses straighten their backs, models hold their breath. Assistant designers adjust sketches in silence. She walks slowly, but every step has a precise intention. She knows she is observed as one observes a living symbol, but she never performs that role. She simply continues to be the director, the boss, the woman who has dictated the rhythm for decades. On the day preceding her final runway show, she works as always. She reviews a sleeve, corrects the curve of a collar, asks that a yellow jacket be restructured from the base. No one imagines that this will be one of her last creative gestures. Her collaborators notice that she is tired, but there is no complaint on her face. She remains faithful to her style, even in exhaustion, as if the habit of discipline had erased any possibility of giving in to discouragement. Her legacy is already secured, although she does not seem fully aware of it. Chanel knows that she has created something no one else could have created. But she does not think in terms of posterity. She thinks in terms of precision, of work well done, of not tolerating a fabric that falls poorly. Posterity is something that belongs to others, not to the one who is focused on today's stitch. And so, between perfume laboratories, tweed workshops, mirrors that repeat her figure, and the elegant silence of the Ritz, Coco moves into the final stage of her life with the same determination she showed since childhood. As if death were just another obstacle to be faced with head held high and shoulders straight. Her story is about to close the circle. Although in that final stretch, there is still one last gesture left that will definitively seal her bond with the maison she directed until her final breath. The Empire after Coco. On the 2nd of January of 1971, in a suite at the Hotel Ritz that she had turned into her refuge for decades, Coco Chanel dies at the age of 87. After a life that had passed through orphanages, cabarets, wars, commercial triumphs, and personal scandals, it is said that, shortly before, she was still reviewing details of the next collection, as if time itself were not a sufficient argument to convince her that she could stop working. The news spreads quickly through Paris, and soon the entire world learns that the woman who had reinvented the way women dress has physically disappeared, even though what she created is far too deeply rooted in culture to dissipate with a single newspaper announcement. The funeral, sober and laden with symbolism, brings together figures from fashion, aristocracy, art, and the business world. All dressed in dark tones, many of them wearing suits and accessories created by Chanel herself, as if her presence were manifested in the geometry of the jackets, in the pearls, in the handbags, with golden chains. It is a public farewell that confirms something that had already been sensed for years. The person is gone, but the system she built, the set of visual and sensory codes she left installed in the minds of millions of people, will continue to function long after she is no longer there to supervise it. In business terms, the great question that opens after her death is what to do with a maison so openly identified with a single figure, with a personality so dominant that it seemed impossible to replace. The Wertheimer family, which already controlled the most profitable part of the business through perfume, understands that the survival of the brand cannot depend on searching for a new Coco, because no one could replicate that mixture of extreme biography and intuitive talent. The strategy requires a different kind of approach, preserving the fundamental codes she had established and allowing new hands to interpret them according to the needs of each moment. The first years after her death are a period of transition, with discrete creative directions, collections that attempt to respect the classic silhouette, the tweed jacket, the two-piece suit, the simple little dress. But the true turning point arrives in 1983, when the Maison decides to appoint Karl Lagerfeld as creative director. Lagerfeld is a young, brilliant designer, recognized for his ability to absorb cultural references quickly. and he arrives at Chanel with a mixture of respect and audacity, aware that he has in his hands an extremely powerful historical archive, but also that a brand without risk runs the danger of becoming a museum piece. His first major success lies in understanding that he does not have to update Coco, but rather to engage in dialogue with her. He rescues the essential elements of the Chanel vocabulary: embroidered jackets, tweed, pearls, black and white, quilted handbags, chains, the interlocking logo, and takes them into new territories, mixing them with contemporary trends, playing with volumes, accessories, and high-impact advertising campaigns. With him, the double C becomes a global emblem, something recognizable on a street corner in Tokyo, in a magazine in New York, or in the window of a boutique in Dubai. A symbol that condenses luxury, tradition, and modernity into two initials that seem so obvious, it is hard to imagine that this graphic ever did not exist. The final decades of the 20th century see Chanel transform into a conglomerate of products that continue to orbit around the same central idea. Perfumes, makeup, eyewear, watches, jewelry, ready-to-wear collections, haute couture, lines for different seasons. Each launch is tinged, in one way or another, by Coco's imaginary. The independent woman, elegant sobriety, comfort elevated to the category of luxury, that blend of discipline and rebellion that she embodied without ever theorizing it. Lagerfeld builds spectacular fashion shows, turns the Grand Palais of Paris into monumental stages, recreates luxury supermarkets, airports, beaches, space stations, without ever abandoning the Chanel elements that serve as a visual anchor. Meanwhile, the Wertheimer family, with figures such as Alain Wertheimer at the forefront, guarantees the economic stability and international expansion of the empire. They handle the less visible part of the story: investments, licenses, logistics, distribution, territorial strategy. If Coco was the instinct, the gaze, and the temperament that gave shape to the spirit of the brand, they are the cold structure that allowed that spirit to become a global machine. The combination of directed creativity and rigorous business management ensures that Chanel not only survives the death of its founder, but is amplified by it. The public image of the Maison is supported by campaigns starring actresses, models, and influential figures who reinterpret Chanel femininity in a contemporary key. From Catherine Deneuve and Carol Bouquet to Nicole Kidman, Audrey Tautou, Keira Knightley, Penelope Cruz, or Margot Robbie, along with iconic faces of fashion such as Inès de la Fressange, Claudia Schiffer, or Naomi Campbell. Each of them embodies, in her own way, the archetype of the Chanel woman: confident, aware of her value, elegant without excess, the owner of her presence in every context. The message, repeated again and again over decades, ends up permeating popular culture to the point that, for many people, being dressed in Chanel is a shorthand way of saying that someone possesses an elegance that requires no explanation. From an entrepreneurial perspective, the trajectory after Coco's death leaves several powerful lessons. The first is the importance of building a brand that does not depend solely on the physical presence of its founder, no matter how charismatic that founder may be. Chanel succeeded in materializing her vision into concrete, repeatable, adaptable codes that allow other designers to work within a clear framework without losing the essence. The second is the relevance of diversifying the business model. The perfume number 5 turned into a talisman of global desire, sustained and amplified the prestige of the Maison when clothing collections could be more or less risky. The third, perhaps the most subtle, is the relationship between coherence and reinvention. The house has faithfully maintained a core of values while allowing itself to experiment on the periphery. In parallel, her personal figure, with its lights and shadows, becomes the subject of biographies, documentaries, films, and critical analyses that revisit her again and again, both to celebrate her genius and to examine her most controversial decisions. The relationship with the occupiers during the war, the harsh treatment of her workers, the ambiguous maneuvers with partners and rivals. In that sense, Chanel is not a comfortable character. She does not fit the perfect mold of a spotless heroine. She has dark areas, contradictions, rough edges that make her humanity more complex, and that, paradoxically, make her business story more interesting for those who truly want to understand what it means to build an empire from nothing. At the same time, her name is used in debates about feminism, fashion, women's economic autonomy, and the commodification of luxury. There are those who see her as a pioneer who opened paths, and those who point to her as someone who, in many respects, operated within the limits of her time and took advantage of power structures that did not always favor other women. The truth is that her work allowed millions of women to dress in a way that gave them greater freedom of movement, and that her example as a businesswoman who neither married nor legally depended on a man as a supporting figure became, whether one likes it or not, a reference of independence. With the death of Lagerfeld in 2019 and the continuation of the Maison under new creative directions, the history of Chanel continues to be written, which demonstrates that Coco's true legacy was not only a set of iconic garments or legendary perfume, but a complete system, a way of understanding elegance as a tool for personal construction, a company capable of withstanding wars, changes of century, cultural transformations, and new generations of consumers. Every time a woman puts on a tweed jacket, slips the strap of a quilted handbag over her shoulder, or perfumes herself with a few drops of No. 5 before leaving home, she is, perhaps without thinking about it, connecting with that girl who was once abandoned in an orphanage, and who decided that the world was not going to write the ending of her story for her. And although time continues to move forward, with new brands, new styles, and new forms of consumption, there is something in the Chanel silhouette, in its blend of austerity and strength, of rigor and lightness, that continues to function as an aesthetic and entrepreneurial compass, reminding us that some ideas, when they are built from experience, discipline, and a non-negotiable vision, can cross generations without losing their ability to influence how we see ourselves. And above all, how we choose to present ourselves to others. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life and legacy of Coco Chanel, a story that shows how a vision can transform entire industries. If you would like us to continue exploring other great entrepreneurs, tell me in the comments, suggest the next protagonist. Do not forget to subscribe so you do not miss any of the documentaries that are coming. Good night.